Thank you all for coming. On behalf of the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies, it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Venerable Ajahn Sona. So please join me in welcoming this evening's speaker.
Before I begin, will start with a traditional homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Well, I give many talks. I'm recently trying to assess how many talks and interactions with people I've had as a monk, and this might be good for historians as well. So I figure I've given 10,000 personal interviews, so sitting one-on-one with people, talking about Dhamma or Buddhism in their lives in a one-to-one. That's part of what I do as a monk and as an abbot of a Theravada forest monastery. And then I give Dhamma talks, and so now I'm thinking about 3,500 hours of talks over the last 25 years or so. And this is the first one I've actually just talked about my biography, so I feel quite confident that I am the world's leading authority on this. And many of the previous Dhamma talks, I must admit, I wasn't certain that I was saying the exact authentic Dhamma, but in this case, I'm pretty sure I'll get it right. This talk, one of the other things I do as a monk is sometimes do interfaith talks and meetings. And I recall about 10 years ago, an interfaith with a rabbi, a native Canadian Indian princess of one of the local tribes, and a Ukrainian Orthodox Christian named Bozhenka, who was an artist, and myself as a Buddhist monk. A very interesting, enjoyable experience talking from our different traditions. But Bozhenka was also a painter, an artist. So she had painted her life before she gave the talk, and she had displayed the painting behind her. But at the end of the talk, she took a pair of scissors and cut the painting up, gave everybody a piece of the painting. So I'm not an artist, I'm not a visual artist. Actually, my background is in music, but in some ways, I'm going to talk about my life pertaining to Dhamma, but at the end of it, each of you will go away with a piece of it. And although I can't share it in such a spectacular fashion, from the heart, I hope that I will have shared some aspect of my Dhammic life with everybody in the room and everybody who eventually sees the streaming video. Now, I'm familiar with this term streaming video as well, because this is part of Buddhism in the West now, the media and the possibility of accessing large numbers of people through these means. So many of these thousands of hours of talks I've given have also been recorded and videoed, and so they go out, and that also feeds back on your consciousness while you're talking. You realize you're being recorded, and so it somewhat alters the contents in some ways. So that's a feature of modern Buddhism, which cannot be overlooked and is very important. Anyway, I will start at the beginning. The brief bio is that I talk about 40 years. Now, I was basically in philosophy and classical music, actually a classical musician, and I wasn't a mathematician, so it's actually about 38 years in this life. Sometime in 1978 is my first encounter with a Tibetan monk. Now, of course, I had awareness of Buddhism. I'd read about Buddhism before that, and so this was in Toronto. But I was in the music faculty at the University of Toronto, and a friend of mine was sitting beside me in a lounge, somewhat like this, and he was reading a Buddhist book, and I was reading Buddhist books, and I said, "Are you into this too? You know, you're reading a Buddhist book?" He says, "Yeah." Are you doing anything about it? Do you meditate or anything? He said, "Yeah, I go to see a Tibetan Lama." I said, "There's a Tibetan Lama in Toronto?" "Yes, yeah." I go, "When do you go?" I said, "Wednesdays. I go Wednesdays." I said, "Take me with you." So we went to see the Tibetan Lama. He's actually a tulku, which I was not familiar with, but it's more or less a reincarnated master. So he was the abbot of the monastery at 5. And he had to leave with the Chinese invasion as well. And so in some ways it was tragic for the Tibetans, but fortunate for the West that all the Tibetan diaspora was spread all throughout the world. I would not have had the opportunity to meet a Tibetan monk unless the Chinese had kindly caused them to disperse throughout the world. So I went there, and it was in a little house, as most of the Dhamma communities at that time, the sanghas, the little local sanghas, and there were 2 types usually, Zen and the Tibetan communities. And they had a lot of resonance. They had a similar thing. You would find them basically in a standard city house with nothing in the living room except a shrine and some mats. And they would just have perhaps rented the thing and converted the house. And they would have usually a cultural following from their own ethnic communities who would have a deep relationship to the monks. And in the case of the Tibetans, they were deeply emotionally reliant on the monks because they were expelled from their country. Other communities, which I'll talk about later, were also highly emotionally dependent on the monks just because they were voluntarily had left their countries and were in a new culture, and in Canada, a very cold and somewhat alien culture to Buddhist practice, and they could take solace in the presence of a monk. I can't tell you how important it really is to a expatriate community to have, of a Buddhist community, to have just the sight of a monk, and especially the offering, to hear the chanting, to hear something they grew up with, and the warm interaction, the warm and heartfelt interaction of usually offering food to the monk, and then of course a certain social dimension to it as well, and the opportunity for one-on-one advice and counseling. So that's a feature of these early communities. And in this case, so I was a classical guitarist, and in the arts. And so when I went in there was about 5 or 6 young Canadians, males in their 20s. It seemed to me that most of the sort of hardcore community at that time were males rather than females, at least in the Tibetan community. Later on in the Zen community, a higher representation of women. These young men, some of them were actually living in the house with the Lama, and they really had picked up all of the refinements of posture and culture and everything, and I had not. And so the first thing they did, in the Tibetan tradition, they do full body prostrations. So all these 5 young guys who, probably a year difference in our ages, all probably going to university or having finished, they suddenly dropped to the floor, face first, full-length prostrations, got up, stood, and not a word of instruction for me, just like they did this. And I thought, well, I'm from the arts, I can do this. So I threw myself down face first on the floor and did the prostrations. It kind of reminded me of theater in some way, and was a grand gesture, and that's also part of arts. Is it's a grand gesture in public, and a full body expression of something. And then we sat, and of course, particularly the Tibetan colors, this kind of yellow and maroon color is the flavor when you go into a little early 70s Tibetan community house. You're going to find that particular color scheme. There'll be other little communities I will talk about along the way with different color schemes, but there's a certain resonance with all of them. The monk came out and was quite young, probably 30 at the time or so, very youthful, and the features of his face were quite pure. He'd been raised in a monastery since the age of 5, and certain kind of sense of like pure, clean water, spring water almost, that you can't, it's hard to get in a person who has been raised in ordinary society. The kind of the sense of the personality, somewhat untouched by worldly concerns. He then proceeded to give very brief instructions on meditation, which, strangely, I had read quite a bit about Buddhism, and somehow it escaped my attention that they meditated. Because I understood the word meditation in it as an English word, which means to think, to meditate, to think. Now, it's hard for me to even remember how I thought about this idea of meditation. And so he gave brief instructions about breath meditation, and I can remember them crystal clear to this day. This is 38 years ago. And he talked about the feeling of the air at the nostrils, and to this day, this is the type of instructions I give on breath meditation to people. And then after a few minutes, he went silent. And I had not even been told to close my eyes or anything like that, so it would be as if, as you watch me now, with the presumptions of Western lectures and so forth, that I suddenly went silent and did not speak for the next 50 minutes. Let's try that. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, he went silent and did not speak for the next 50 minutes. And I was left looking around the room, waiting. There was no indication of time or anything like that. But every now and then, his eyes were closed, but every now and then he would open his eyes and look around, and our eyes would meet in a very uncomfortable way. Anyway, finally, at the end of it, he rang a bell, and it was apparently over. And then he looked at me, and he made this gesture. He looked at me, and he said, "Close your eyes." Anyway, the next time I kind of got on to the idea that what was happening. But that was my first encounter with monastics and meditation. And of course, that experience, I didn't really meditate, but it was uncanny, really. Now, this is where larger contexts of Buddhism come in. You know, I mean, I'm from the West, born and raised in Canada. Middle-class family, has nothing to do with, no real religious structures. I went to an Anglican church when I was a kid, but it just, drifted away from that. Not through my own lack of interest, but we just had moved to someplace where there's no access to this. So religion in general had just kind of drifted out the door. My family fundamentally not religious. And I was interested in the meaning of life, and in fact that's why I entered university first in philosophy. I thought they might know something there at the university. I mean, if they don't, then who does? But I'm getting ahead of myself with that story. But I've come through a Western education and Western philosophical tradition, and I think quite attracted to a skeptical view of things, and probably what we would call, one of my favorites at that time was a fellow named Bertrand Russell of the positivist school. very dismissive of most religious ideas and values. I was quite impressed with his intellect and the kind of language. So I'm coming from that, but at the same time, happy to explore and to open-mindedly try things. But what struck me was how comfortable I was with these people. I felt that they were my family somehow. I felt so at home with them. And I thought, that's very odd. They feel like my real family. And I would say from this point, my point of view now, that this is a kind of, this is memory. I'm remembering something. I don't know it's a memory. I'm like an amnesia victim who's wandered into something that's familiar to them, and it's all coming back in a moving way. I feel, wow, I found some people that I'm on the same wavelength. These are my people. So anyway, so we continued to study, and the Tibetan structures, at least some of them, are quite interested in formal intellectual study. So we went and we were sent to an obscure bookstore in Toronto called The Fifth Kingdom, and we were to buy a book called Birth, Death, and Intermediate State. And we were all to read it chapter by chapter and then come and discuss it in detail. What happens when you die? What happens at the moment of death? The stages of light, this intermediate state, the bardos and so forth. So this was right off the bat, we sat down and discussed it. It's very interesting. As a monk now, a Theravada monk who talks a lot to Western audiences primarily, we, and myself, and generally as monks, we tend to kind of skip around a lot about the reincarnation thing. Although I do sometimes just give a whole talk on it, because it's easy to just get too concerned with not pushing the boundaries of people's ordinary expectations and trying to stay with the psychological benefits and the meditative benefits. But it was very different in that community. And I'm so happy that they didn't dumb it down for me, that we started right off the bat with this, like what happens, and all the amazing refinements of details of the types of lights you're going to see, and what the effect of consciousness at the moment of death, and what happens between lives, and so forth, in sort of a scientific descriptions. I've never come across anything like that in any of my philosophical traditions at the time. Later on, and much later in my life, I've gone back and actually read Greek philosophy, Roman philosophy, European philosophy from beginning to end with this from a point of view of a Buddhist monk. And in fact, I gave a 3-hour talk at the Kamloops University, nearest town, on Plato's Republic at the invitation of the political science, to make us realize that academic history and philosophy may have missed a huge amount of understanding of early Greek philosophers and how they really thought, and that it's possible that Buddhist monks might be able to recover a whole different aspect of what people like Socrates, Plato, and even Aristotle were really up to, and how they really thought, and what really was important in their lives. So it's an interesting kind of loop back from understanding equivalent times in the 5th century BC. The Buddha is approximately 5th century BC. The Greek philosophers are approximately at the same time, and they have different ways of thinking and feeling about things, and it can inform that. So that's also affected my process, because I had been exposed to academic philosophy. And when I took philosophy, there was no mention of anything but Greek philosophy, Roman philosophy, European philosophy, Christian theological philosophy, philosophy. There wasn't in the universities I went to at the time, this is 1972, there was no, you didn't study Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, Buddhist philosophy. They weren't available in the universities. There was one university, University of Toronto, that had some Buddhist studies, but I wasn't there at the time. So I was affected by this, but not consciously. I still had no idea the effect of what I was doing on me. It was curious, it was interesting, it was liberating, but I had no idea that what sort of what's going on at a deeper level, the unconscious level, when you start doing these things. Anyway, I continued and I discovered I was also reading Zen at the time, and lots of people were. Zen is a great cultural influence on all kinds of aspects of art and music, and I'd come across it even in classical music. Some of the composers in classical music from the 50s, John Cage in particular, were affected by this arrival of Zen and the American experience with Japan in the Second World War and the encounter and the books on Zen and so forth, and it affected art and music. So I knew to some degree about it through that, but I was also interested in reading the books. And so eventually, much to my surprise, I also came across a poster on a telephone pole as I was walking down a street in Toronto that said, Buddha's Birthday, Zen Lotus Society, and gave an address. It was a handmade thing stapled onto a telephone pole, and I thought, I'm going there. So I went to the Buddha's Birthday and at a Korean Zen temple at the Zen Lotus Society in Toronto, which had been established by a Korean monk who also had entered the robes as a child in a different way than the Tibetan monk. He had been one of the sort of casualties of the Korean War. His father had been killed and his mother went crazy, and he ended up as an urchin scavenging in the streets with gangs of 6- and 7-year-olds in the alleyways of Seoul. And he had found his way eventually into a temple and had quite an adventurous, difficult life, and eventually left Korea and arrived in Canada. And he had no form of support, so I think he had a few jobs. He got also tuberculosis. Quite a difficult start, but eventually he just couldn't leave it, and he started a kind of a meditation group and temple, and so that was the next one. And again, in the same you walk into a house where the living room has no furniture in it, and it has that Zen feel, very, very clean, very lots of grays and browns in this case, rather than the yellows and the purples. And the aesthetic of it I thought, the Tibetan thing, they're my cousins. These people are my direct blood relatives. These are my brothers and sisters. So somehow, again, this intuition, this feeling, I'm drawn to them as even closer to what I feel. And it's becoming eerie kind of. I'm still not putting this together with actual recollection or some sort of, I'm just thinking they're kind of on very much closer to my wavelength. And so I started to practice there. And again, one of the first teachings I received was breath meditation. It's very interesting that all the 3 schools that I practiced in have as one central practice this breath meditation, which to this day is still what I teach and practice as a dominant meditation practice. Not the only, but as a very important one. In that tradition, it's it has its flavors too, and it has this tradition of koans, like strange questions, and they have a certain kind of vibrant energy as well. And in the meditations, it's very strict, and they also use a stick, which if you are nodding or anything, they'll whap you with this. It's very interesting crossing the the personal boundaries of Westerners. First time I had an interview with the Korean monk, which they generally had a beautiful introductory course about 6 weeks long before you could even sort of join the meditation group. And it was beautifully well done. In fact, I've modeled some of our own introductions on it. But they had neglected to say a few things to me. So one day I was there and it was interview time. And the interviews are done in a private interview room, and there's a bell rung, and you're supposed to just get up and run there. It's sort of more or less to show respect. You run to the interview, up these stairs. Now that's a problem if your leg is asleep. It can be quite funny sometimes, painful. But anyway, I ran to I figured out you run to the interview room, and they'd not prepped me for this. So then I went in and I failed to bow, which was discussed later. But I sat down face to face in a very small room with the monk, and he said, "What brings you here?" And what brings me here? I mean, you rang the bell. And he said, "That's pretty good." And then he rang the bell again and said, "Go." And I got up and left. And he said to the nun, he said, "By the way, teach him how to bow." And I thought, what just happened there? You rang the bell, I ran there, you asked me what brings me here, and then I said the bell, and then you said pretty good, and then that was the end. So that was the beginning of something different, a different encounter from going to visit your professor of romantic music studies or something like that. Very different. So a different kind of strange, poetic, different type of psychology. Not linear, no study, especially emphasis in the Zen tradition of direct pointing without reference to the suttas, in case, different than the Tibetan, where we sat down with these quite scholastic types of textbooks and examined the details of the teaching. Very, very different atmosphere and feeling. Anyway, I proceeded to continue to meditate with them, and I had made, this is now probably 1980, and I've been meditating for a few years now, and I didn't really even know that it was supposed to change you in any way or whatever, but I didn't really notice that it had changed me at all. And one day I showed up a little early for the meditation, and there was a Zen nun who was teaching yoga before the meditation, and I was just early, so I joined. I'd never done yoga before, and we did this very stretching and breathing, holding the breath, exhaling, so forth. And then we sat down, and it was for Western bodies really, because Western bodies are really not used to the types of sittings that we do, but they were very systematic in trying to help us be a little more comfortable with this. But anyway, after this, I sat down, and my mind became rather, really calm, quite unexpectedly. Had never done that before, and I thought, this is what they're talking about. I see. This is very different. This is the first time, I spent, up to that time, what did I spend? 19 years in school, and what you're what you do there is they try to show you the on button for thinking. They turn that button of discursive activity on, critical thinking, questions and answers, and if you can answer questions, you get good marks, and if you don't answer the question and you don't think in the way they ask you to, then you will get not good marks. And so they really show you the on switch, and there's a certain development of maybe your prefrontal cortex, extraordinary activity of discursive activity, analytical activity. By the way, when I went into philosophy, when I was 18 or whatever it was, I had no idea what philosophy was. I thought it might be about the meaning of life, but I did take logic as well. And it turned out I was logical. I didn't know that. How would you know that you were logical? But anyway, after I wrote the exams, I got this kind of perfect mark on the logic exam. So it turned out I'm logical. And what it really means is that I think too much, and in a linear fashion, and in a logical fashion. Notice that I favored Bertrand Russell. This is a great disease, a very unfortunate. It's okay when it's your servant, when it's a mere handmaiden in the house, but when it runs the place, it's a terrible thing to have running your inner life. Linear, discursive, purely logical activity should not be the master of the house. That's not where humans live. And so I was kind of using this tool to try to solve problems that are inappropriate to that tool. And poor Bertrand Russell spent the rest of his life using a very highly refined scalpel to solve, inappropriately, to solve the deeper issues of the existential meaning of life for humans. And it's that tool is merely a tool. It's not how the ultimate inner issue is solved. And I'm just incredibly grateful to this day, every day of my life, that I did blunder into meditation. And the fundamental use and point of this, especially breath meditation, you notice I was talking about breath meditation, it is an antidote to excessive discursive activity. It is given by the Buddha to monks in the early times. He knew that when they would go out and sit under a tree, and perhaps for the rest of your life you're going to be just kind of hanging around under trees in little cabins with no sensory stimulation, no entertainment, no nothing. What do you do? Of course, the first thing you do is, the only thing you know is you think. You start thinking about things. And this is just erodes you if you continue to do this. Is there any other way to be well, happy, peaceful, lucid, clear, unanxious, to treat the emotional afflictions as well as the intellectual excessiveness? And it is through this use of the breath meditation that shuts down a certain part, I'm talking in modern terms, of your brain. They didn't know about brains in those days. They didn't care about brains, but they knew about minds. And so that is one of the most profound blessings that I've received from this, because I did absolutely fine in the academic world and also in the world of arts. I was a classical musician. That's how I made my living. It's not, you might think if you're in the thinking side of academia that it must be nice to be able to wallow in great music from the European classical tradition. And it is from time to time, but it doesn't rescue you from the age of anxiety, which is the fundamental problem of our times, is that we're riddled with anxiety as a result of a number of historical causes. In a way, this was some way to actually reduce that and to become lucid. Discursive thinking is is symbolic. And you become excessively symbolic and abstract, and everything becomes, you don't experience direct reality anymore. Everything's behind glass. And that's what I felt at the time, was that there'd been a great kind of diminishment of the vitality of my life. Stuff that I felt as a child was no longer available. It was all symbolic and abstract, and it wasn't directly available to me. I couldn't step into spring. It was all behind a window. I could talk about it, I could label it, I could maybe even write a piece of music about it, or play a piece of music about it, Vivaldi or something, spring, the Four Seasons. But I couldn't be in spring. And this is some of the language of Zen, actually, is are you a spring man? They sometimes ask, are you a spring man? The freshness of spring, are you fresh once more? Have you returned to that earlier nature? And this is what can happen with the reduction of the excessive life within just the abstract and discursive area of the mind. It's important to discover this. What the West doesn't know about it. It probably did until maybe the 15th, 16th century, and it got lost. It probably knew about it in the contemplative orders, certainly the Catholic contemplative orders, and then it was diminished in its importance, and something else took its place. And I'm just, as I say, emotionally, of all the great gifts that I've been given by the Dhamma, that is the one that has relieved pain most greatly and deeply. That's incredibly important to say that they are using the mind in a different way. And so then I had no expectation of what the effect this is having on me. But when you start to experience life in that different way, the symbolic life, which is primarily where people live, you become disenchanted. You start to lose your interest in the matter. And this is what the aim of it is, actually. It's quite alarming to become disenchanted. At first you don't know whether you're just depressed or what, but you're losing interest in things that you formerly had interest in. And it's not something you consciously understand. You arrive at something, like I was a great reader of things, haunting bookstores and libraries and stuff. I like to go on long walks, 10-mile walks through Toronto, and stop at different bookstores and read in installments the same book. But in a way, I was being handed strange experiences. Like I would get there and I would look for a book, which normally would just be fascinating, and I just would end up walking out of the store without being able to be interested enough to look at any of them. And I found that alarming. And not only alarming, but my livelihood and my training was in music, and I was losing interest in that too. The best product of European high art, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, all of which I had spent years. I started very young with this, but gave up on philosophy because they didn't know the meaning of life. And I thought, well, at least it's a harmless occupation to be a classical musician. So that was my livelihood and everything. But I was losing interest in it, and that's alarming. And there's nothing I could do about it. It didn't mean what it used to mean. And that's one of the side effects of meditation. Certain types of meditation, you're becoming disengaged from the sensory world, the world of sights and sounds, smells, tastes, touches, and ideas. Discursive activity was my other haunt. So if I wasn't playing some Bach or something, I was reading Tolstoy or reading books. And both are starting to fall away. And that's a feature of Buddhist teaching, is nibbida, the disappointment and disenchantment in the world. What world? The world is experienced through the senses, so that when they talk about the world, they talk about sights and sounds, smells, taste, touches, and discursive activity of the mind. This is the world. This is how you experience the world. That's the world which is problematic, actually has an underlying problem to it. That's a core message of the Buddha. It's one of the Four Noble Truths as well. And so whether I had understood it or not, it was starting to erode, and that was very problematic. I actually entered a monastery, the Korean Zen monastery, for a period of time as a meditator. While I was in this disenchanted mode, which I'm still in, but happily, very, very happily disenchanted. There's no contradiction between the disenchantment you're disenchanted with the sensory world, but a new world has come up to replace it, and it's a more consistent and steady and reliable mode. It doesn't appear instantly. The other one tends to fall away first before a new growth has replaced it, so it's a bit of a difficult transition. I was trying to solve this problem, and I went to New York City, and I don't know, it was 3 or 4 days, I guess 5 days. And I went to the opera and the jazz clubs and ate at restaurants and went to Broadway, and I went to art galleries, and nothing. All flat, absolutely flat. Saw some of the best performers in the world, some of the great art, flat, like a little scary. And anyway, I went into the Metropolitan Museum, and I think there was a painting by Van Gogh there, Sunflower, and that kind of cheered me up for about a minute. But not anything. And I eventually found my way to a very large room, twice the size of this, with a 50-foot ceiling. And in that room was a little shack, a Taoist hermit's shack from 12th century China. And it had been given to Richard Nixon on his visit to 1972 to China. What a strange gift to give to Richard Nixon. I'm sure you all remember him. And he didn't know what to do with it, so he gave it to the Metropolitan, and they featured it. It was the only thing in the room, and I went down, and it was hope. It was a hermit. And I felt this incredible connection, like, what a wonderful thing. Now that cheers me up. Absolute simplicity and aloneness, absolute solitude in nature. That profoundly appealed to me. I realized that nothing in the Big Apple had tasted good. It no longer had any magic for me. But this gave me hope. It was such a synchronistic kind of experience. Just how fortunate I was to just blunder across that, because when I came back, it wasn't too long, and I trained in the Zen tradition for a few years, and I did decide then to become a hermit. And I left everything, and it's a very chancy thing to do. There was no formal, really supportive. There was no such thing as a forest monastery in North America at that time. This is probably 1983, and the first one was established in 1988. So I went, and how do you do this? I could only go on texts and Chinese, sort of knowing that people did this, that there were hermits. Cold Mountain, poems, Han Shan's Cold Mountain. And it's very vague, it's just a few handfuls of things. But I'd found out how they did this. How could you live alone in removed from the world? How do you do this? It's only after you know how to meditate that you can possibly do this. You'll be running for town in a very short time if you don't know. So eventually I did find my way, and I did find a little shack, broken down shack in the middle of the Coast Mountains of British Columbia for $50 a month. It was overpriced at that. And I lived there for some years as a hermit and practiced. By this time I had come across the earlier tradition of the Theravada tradition and the earliest suttas and texts, and I had some of those with me. I very deliberately did not take any other types of books with me. I had no electricity, no phone, no nothing. It's just, I get a bucket of water out of a river. I cut my own firewood by hand, and just a bare minimum of existence. The nearest town's 20 miles away. I have to hitchhike every few weeks to get some food on the side of this road in the Canadian winter. And there's just one, it's a highway that peters out at the end in a little Indian village. So very, like once an hour a car comes by, or a logging truck. So that was my life for a period of time, and I just waited there. A Sri Lankan man became aware of me, that I was practicing Buddhism in such a kind of a dedicated way, and he was kind of, it moved him. He was in Vancouver, and he thought, you know, if this, and he was a born Buddhist, you know, culturally born Buddhist, and he was quite inspired, and he came to visit me, and I asked him, did he know of any place where I could ordain like a forest monastery? And he called the various monks in North America of the Theravada tradition. I was now very interested in the Theravada tradition. And nothing. But then one day, some years went by, and one day a note on my door, that's the only way you could communicate with me, leave a note on the shack door. He said that there was a monk traveling named Venerable Piyadasi, and he was nearby, and if I wanted to go and see him, I could, and so I did. And he said, I just came from the first forest monastery in North America, in the Theravada tradition, and it's in West Virginia, and it's really good, and the abbot there is a meditator and good, and so I wrote to them. In those days, there was no email, right? I wrote to them, hitchhiked to the post box, put the letter in, waited 2 weeks, hitchhiked back, and they said, sure, come on down. So I got on the plane, went down there, and spent one night in Washington, D.C., in a hotel room, sleeping on the floor beside the bed, not turning on the TV. And then I went to West Virginia, and I was the first monk ordained there. So it was a very bizarre, looking back, it was like I was too early. I was ready to be in the forest tradition, and only the forest tradition, not urban, and many monks, of course, are urban monks. There's a lot more village monks and urban monks than forest monks, but I was exclusively interested in dwelling in the forest, so I went there, and it was just like coming home, and I was the first monk ordained there, and it's still going well. I spent 2.5 years there, and went on to Thailand to experience the forest tradition there with Ajahn Chah's tradition, who at that time was virtually unknown, but now is quite well known, actually, in the small Buddhist world we have. He's kind of famous. He's been dead for 22, 23 years, I guess, and his books are still coming out by him. He never wrote a book in his life, but they're still coming out by disciples and so forth who were with him. And so that was a total immersion experience in a total Buddhist culture in the forest tradition, and it was like stepping back into early times. Then I brought it back to Canada, started my own series of monasteries, because we started as a shack again, a broken down shack in the middle of nowhere, in the robes, And now we're there for another 3.5 years. And then enough people support us that we got a place that other people could come and stay. And now we moved to our present location, which is ideal, very large building, 10,000 square feet, with various little cottages and kutis and so forth in the middle of nowhere, in the pristine forest of Canada. And the forest is like starting again. And my main inspiration is actually the early suttas. We can't build a huge Buddha image where people make pilgrimages to it, because that's the mark of a mature culture. It happens a long time afterwards. Where I get my information is from the earliest, when India was not Buddhist, when the Buddha was walking around trying to figure out, how do we do this? Where will we stay? He meets somebody, an accident, they put a few things here, there, they have different experiences, they learn, and that's the stage we're in. And that's where my inspiration comes from, the earliest suttas. How do you teach lay people? Do you meet resistance? Yeah. The Buddha himself has all kinds of encounters where he's insulted and so forth. And occasionally, of course, the opposite, he changes people's lives. So this is very close to, more appropriate to our time. Strangely enough, the earliest times when it's a new philosophy, a new teaching, a new religion in India is the most appropriate model for us to use in the bringing this into the West. And note that it is not a little house downtown Vancouver or Toronto with nothing, no furniture in the living room and its own particular colors. It's in this environment which the Buddha said again and again and again, go to the forest, monks. The forest there's a special, it's especially helpful to the practice. And so we built quite a substantial place with accommodation available for lay people to also come and join us in the forest and to practice for extended, long periods of time. And as I come down to the last few minutes of this talk, no, I have till 7:30, yes. Yeah.
Ideally, if we can leave some space for questions.
Yes, I will. Keep me on track, please. So we have an opportunity to allow lay people to practice in this tradition. And I think I have a lot to say, because the people who show up are really, they're from the arts class, the intellectual class, the artistic class, philosophical class, the adventurer class. This is who shows up. And I know their illness. I know that their cortex is overworked, and that anxiety, that you cannot solve the basic issue through thinking and discursive activity. And so I have two primary approaches to them. One is the breath meditation, in order to reduce discursive activity and find out there is another way to be conscious, wide awake, but not harassed by your own thinking processes, and not believing that the entire world is understood through linear thinking processes. That there's another way to be. And the other structure which I endlessly practice and teach is loving kindness, or what we call metta. Metta is a form of a word mitta, which is friend. To be a profound sense of friendship with the beings around you, a friendliness, a concern for the well-being and safety of others and yourself. And this is, of course, the main issue is yourself. That's the problem. That's the one it's hard to practice loving kindness for. So there's something wrong in the structure of society and the way psychology is formed. There's a great deal of extraordinary critical faculty, people that are, I would say, above average in almost every dimension show up at the monastery, and they're also above average in self-criticism. there's nothing wrong with them. They're smarter than the average person, more handsome or beautiful, they're more educated, they're talented, they're skilled, and they're extremely harsh with themselves. There's something has happened in the whole structure of our culture this is not just an epidemic, it's endemic. It is somehow built into the way we do things. That's the result you get. Because as I said at the beginning of the talk, I've given 10,000 one-on-one interviews in the last 20 years. I'm not counting anything before that. There were more, but that's a lot of people to talk one-on-one with for at least a half an hour. And now I usually just jump right to the issue. How do you feel? And it's just the first thing that comes out is like, a really enormous kind of hostility towards themselves, a huge level of critical accusation, and their own worst critics. So forth. This is very unfortunate, and this is why we have to practice both profound amount of loving kindness, and quite often in the early days, and many teachers in the West spotted this, and they would start with the formulaic, may I be well, happy, and peaceful. So start with yourself, be loving as if. Now I don't do that anymore. It's actually not how the Buddha taught it. He just said, try to develop some loving kindness. And he didn't say start with yourself. He just said, just develop loving kindness. And the way I teach it now is find any object that you can generate some warmth, friendliness, concern for their safety and well-being. And just do what you can and work with that. I call it making a fire. So using just dry paper and twigs. You don't start with wet logs. And if you're the wet log, don't start with the wet log. Start to get the feeling of this, and then add more and more that you can easily add to it. And if you never get to yourself, fine. But eventually it will encompass you, and you will be included in it. And this is probably the most important. There's two I'd say, most important therapies for your Western European American society, and those two things. Learn how to get outside of your discursive activity as the only possible use of the mind. Find out that there's another way to use your mind in a non-discursive way. And then secondly, discover the meaning of life, and through the emotions, the cultivation of the emotions of loving kindness, and that you will be encompassed by this. And these are the two things, because you can't enter these two worlds through whatever the culture has done to us in some way. You might be fortunate, you might come from a family that has brought you along in a different way, but it's quite rare, and it's not systematically taught. Even, I have dialogues with contemplative Catholic practitioners. One of them is Father Thomas Keating, who has developed this centering prayer idea. And he's developed this contemplative practice because he recognized that the Catholic Church doesn't know about contemplation since the 16th century. And there's no point in asking them. They don't know. So he's inquired in Buddhist practitioners. How do you meditate? How do you do this? And because he's bringing it back for Christian contemplatives as well. And so we had some dialogues as well, with interfaith type dialogues in that. And this seems to me as two fundamental elements which are just universally important and health restoring in the culture. And so I, for the last I came back to Canada 22 years ago and have been teaching and practicing ever since. And I talked to a lot of people and introduced this. And it's really, and of course, now we see mindfulness has caught on. I think the last issue of Time magazine, the entire magazine was devoted to mindfulness. Like, it's quite amazing, being from the earliest kind of fringes of this, to see mainstream acceptance. It's really interesting when we, the monks, walk around these days. Some people know that we're monks. Yeah, it's quite something. And in fact, some people have meditated. Sometimes they put their hands up like this. There's kind of a recognition. Even in a small town in Canada, you'll find people who know that you're a Buddhist monk, and they might have meditated before as well. So this is a radical change. It's growing in enormous ways and through media. So I also want to talk a little bit about how we choose to live in a kind of pristine wilderness. And I really taken a lot of time and effort to do that, not to compromise that, to bring it back to this. We don't have, it's 10 miles to the nearest neighbor. It's just forest. I have moose staring in my window, and bears and coyotes and everything wandering around. It's wonderful, restorative, as much as nature can be. And by the way, nature itself cannot heal you. It's an element in healing, but only after you've got some basic well-being for yourself. The nature can support that, and it will kind of go by itself in nature. You remember I spent some years in the middle of solitary nature in the forest. It wouldn't have helped me if I'd just gone there without the meditative practice. It's the combination of some skills, inner skills, both the emotional skills and how to use your mind, and being in nature, that's the combination of those things. It's not just nature itself. It's not enough, but it's a beautiful element when combined with this. But we also now, and I used to travel to teach and so forth, but I'm trying to wind that in as we have these resources. So YouTube and iTunes and these things, I can record talks like this both in video and in audio, and people can listen. So I've done hundreds of these things. And people in Africa, I was talking to a monk the other day, a Canadian monk, and he said, I've got somebody in Greenland who listens to my Dhamma talks regularly. We just load them up for free. It's all free. This is also part of this Theravada forest tradition. It's a Vinaya tradition. It's such an important part of the tradition is that we're following the earliest rule structure of the code for Buddhist monks, including not handling money. No, the monks in our tradition do not allowed to handle money, not to possess money, not to have money, not to buy anything. So every day of my life since I've been a monk, somebody has offered me food or I didn't eat. And by the way, the meal, you can't accept it after noon. So it's got to be sometime between dawn and noon. And then if you miss that opportunity, you don't eat till the next day, if you eat the next day. It's a total commitment to dependency, and you're not an independent. You're not making a nice little garden or farm or something, making a living. You're remaining vulnerable and dependent. Now, this is also very important to the whole tradition, and all of these talks and so forth. They're all offered for free as well. The Dhamma and all accommodation and so forth at our monasteries is also offered without charge. Yeah. This is I didn't think, who would think it works? But it does work, and it is working, and still working. So I think we should leave some time for questions, if you have any. And I know it takes a little time for your discursive activity to kick back in. Yes, sir. Yes. Uh-huh.
Can you share with us a bit of your understanding of the relationship between the Republic, British Republic,
Yeah.
You said in Buddhism, you mentioned, the lovers of sights and sound, which is a
Yeah.
big topic for him as well.
Yes.
I'm curious how you go.
Yeah, I think that somebody should do a doctoral thesis on the Republic, but get the advice from a Buddhist monk. So the more I read Socrates, as he is, I believe, entering jhana, or a type of state of meditation which suspends discursive activity. And he's reported to stand in a single spot for more than 24 hours without moving. And he is exhibiting many of the features which would just be commonly described as deep, discursive-free meditation. And he's experienced a certain amount of ecstasy in that. And that is his true aspiration. Remember that the philosophers who are going to be separated from society after a good deal of training are going to go into a very simple and austere type of lifestyle, and they're going to develop the higher mind. When Plato, is most famous for this idealism, this idea of a reality behind the sights and sounds and smells and tastes and touches, there are ideas, and there are real objects here, but they're not the real thing. Behind it is an ultimate reality. This corresponds to something in India at the time. The Buddha studied with fellows before he was the Buddha. He studied with people who taught something called the Arupa Jhanas. And he became a master of this. Arupa means formless. And what were the formless topics? You're to contemplate space itself, consciousness itself, nothingness, and neither perception or minimal perception. These are abstract notions. This is the experience of the abstract for the first time. Before that, abstract ideas, a possible use of the mind in abstraction is not known. Plato is, I think, experiencing ecstasy in the contemplation of this ideal, the thing behind reality, this ultimate reality behind it, is similar to the Arupa Jhanas. And so they're cultivating some more or less yogis. Now, the closest approximation to the Republic ever to be produced on the earth is probably Tibet, where the rulers of Tibet are the philosopher king. And the entire society is influenced by this. This is the closest approximation to the Republic. The Republic is really a religious book, and the ultimate aim of it is to produce this this kind of elite group who have exposure to this higher truths. But they're not intellectual truths as academics would have it. Now, why are we called academics, by the way? The grove of Academe. That's where Plato taught. Academe gave him a grove. The Buddha gave Jeta, Vana Grove. They were both teaching in groves. And the academic grove seems to have proliferated. Stanford is a grove of academe. And here you should be moving towards the ecstasy of non-discursive, abstract elements. But no, you get trapped in excessive discursive thinking. This is what I went to the university to find the meaning of life, not to get trapped in excessive discursive thinking. So it's a rich topic, so I just touched on it, but yeah. Anything else? Yeah. Yes?
I had a question about, you mentioned that people now are more accustomed to seeing monks than they were
Yes.
30 years ago. Can you compare the reaction of your family when you decided to become a monk to younger monks, the reaction of their families? Has that changed?
I find some monks, their family's not resistant to it. My family wasn't particularly resistant to it. My mother came to the ordination. My father watched hockey. And he wasn't against it. He was just more for hockey. And he's fine. Actually, when I visit them, No, he's almost 90. He actually has learned to offer the plate to me. Like and he knows that I can't accept it unless it's been offered, and he's quite willing to do that. But younger monks, I think that depending on the background, still there can be a lot of resistance to the idea of becoming a monk in the U.S. from their families. But some of them are sympathetic to it, and some of them are actually, their parents are actually Western Buddhists, and they're quite delighted that their son is actually becoming a monk. So that was never possible before. So we'll have to take a poll sometime in the Sangha, put up their hands, whose parents approve and who do not. We'll see what our percentages are. We have about 150 monks in Ajahn Chah's sort of branch monasteries of the West. So we could do some fairly good statistics, actually, which would be quite interesting. I'm quite interested in the statistics of how this all affects. Note that there's no lifetime vow for monks, that temporary ordination is fairly common. Not all young men last as monks. But one hallmark of it, which was that the Buddha commented at the time, is that it's usually almost never sort of sense of resentment about it. They're often coming back and visiting the monasteries, offering food, and they feel it was one of the most important things they ever did in their lives, and they weren't ready for it, or it wasn't. They were still had questions about ordinary life and so forth. So there's this kind of beautiful friendliness and appreciation of it if you even have been in there temporarily. And sometimes parents are actually transformed by the experience of their son becoming a monk, and after a time they start to change themselves. And sometimes they actually say, I actually appreciate what I've learned from you. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Are there ever nunneries?
Yes, there are. There's recently, in the 90s, basically, very recently, there's been a reintroduction of the idea of bhikkhuni ordination. In the time of the Buddha, he did introduce incredibly advanced ordination for women and egalitarian communities. And this was, 1,000 years before Christian nunneries were developed. It's something so far ahead of its time. We're still catching up to it. So it died out sometime in the traditional Theravada countries, sometime in probably the 13th century. So it lasted for about 1,700 years. But has recently an attempt to restore the full bhikkhuni ordination has been taking place particularly in Sri Lanka. It is still some resistance to this in Thailand and Burma. It is not a done deal yet. But all these cultures have had substitute orders all that time. In Thailand, they have Mechi nuns. They have nuns, but they wear white instead of brown. At my monastery, I have a Thai nun. It has been there for 17 years. And in Burma, they also have an order of women that is a substitute for the older bhikkhuni order. And also in Sri Lanka, they had something that was a replacement for. They felt that the higher ordination had died out for nuns, and they had to replace it with something. And it's only now that some scholars think they can legitimately restore the higher ordination. So it's a work in progress. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about meditation.
Mm-hmm.
Can a person reach the state of non-self, through meditation?
Yeah.
The non-self, you understand?
Yes. So just for the audience as well, a non-self is a kind of one of the most the higher features of Buddhist teachings. It's not easy to explain in 30 seconds or less, but I mean, it accords probably with modern psychology that there's not really a self. You don't. Your self is a concept or a construction of the functions, psychological functions of the mind. There's not a marble in there that's your real self. You know. So I guess modern psychology would have no problem with the idea that the self is a construct. And so the Buddha is saying it's very important that you understand that the self is not real, that our ideas of ourselves and so forth, our theories of ourselves are not real. So how do you, and much of the suffering in your life is because of inappropriate constructs, and these result in delusions, inappropriate relationship to reality, which cause you distress and suffering. And so that meditation is no other than a word for the deconstruction of your delusions, which create the function of a self, a real self, which is not real. It is under examination, tends to fall away or evaporate. And that's what meditation really is the actual word that the Buddha uses is bhavana, or closer to cultivation, almost like gardening exercise. You garden away yourself. You lose yourself in your garden. It's a nice way to, we have to make these things beautiful and appealing, because that's really what you're doing, is you take up a life of a small house and a large garden. Your small house is just the necessities of life, but your real joy is in your garden, And if you garden enough, then you disappear in the garden. Something like that. Yeah. So meditation is the process towards realizing of non-self. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned that you were a musician before.
Yes.
Is it somehow when you do the chanting now, has your previous education as a musician or training as a musician influence your chanting practice?
Yes, it does. Monks, by the way, are not allowed to play music and not allowed to listen to music. So I knew that when I became a monk. And it wasn't really a problem, because I would say the process of disenchantment had arrived before I became a monk. So it wasn't like ripping myself away from my great love of music. It was, I can't find my meaning in life in music anymore, but I can find it in the silence of meditation, However, the remnants, once you're a trained musician, you can never not be a trained musician. It's a relentless sense of sound and what sounds mean. And so when we chant and things like that, whether I like it or not, I try to stay on pitch and things like that. And it's very interesting being thrown in with people who are not musicians, and at the same time we have to chant quite a bit together. And it's quite hard on your ears sometimes, because these this cacophony of bad sounds, and although sometimes after years, sometimes they find the right pitch and everything. It's quite good to be with them, but you have to overcome that. You're not there for the music. The chanting is not music. It's just a radiation of the truth and goodwill, and you have to forget listening to the pitch and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yes?
I was wondering, could you tell us how you perceive time?
Time, that's a good, wow, I actually considered talking a bit about time and space and how, as you meditate, it changes. And then I thought, nah, that's the wrong place to talk about that, this. But thanks for asking. So, time and space are functions of consciousness. Your sense of time and space, not what we call objective. What the clock says, or how many Google Maps says, you know, you have a sense of moving in space and a sense of time. And this is a function of your mind. You know, the difference in when you're bored, how long time seems, and when you're really enjoying yourself, how short it seems. So one of the features of deep concentration is that there's no sense of time, or time seems to have collapsed, or half an hour goes by like a finger snap. Now, if you once your mind starts to change, also your sense of movement in space. You know, have you ever been absorbed in a book while you're on a train or something like that, and then you're suddenly there? And so, just consider what they speak of as miraculous powers or psychic capacities in the text in the time of the Buddha. Monks flying through the air with their legs crossed. The visiting of different dimensions, the time dilations and stuff. If you make it completely what we call subjective, a feature of the way your mind works, and not think about it as objective, you will be much closer to what they're really talking about. That you can begin to distances and moving through space, and the sense of time changes as your mind changes and as you meditate, and not just necessarily in a deep concentration, but the afterglow, the after effects of this also kind of walks around with you. So time just feels differently. Time is very relative to your consciousness. It's just an extension of how you feel about things. It's subjective, and you can alter this by doing these types of mental cultivations, this gardening exercises, you know. So yeah, time and space are subjective experiences, and it becomes more and more apparent to you. You start to really feel, wow, what happened to the time? And in fact, what did happen to the time? So yes.
Well, this prompts another question, because, you know, as Buddhism grows in the West, we have more and more of these mind cultivators.
Yes.
And yet, on the other hand, the whole sort of Silicon Valley,
Yes.
syndrome, if we can call it that,
Yes.
is directly, is really almost the opposite direction, you're saying.
Yes.
And where do you see this going over time?
I think we'll work together. A part of one of the things I do is green monasticism, and I even we have met with the Catholics in Gethsemane in Kentucky, a big monastery, a conference on green monasticism. And so I actually appreciate Elon Musk and these people. Technology will be one of the solutions to some of the major issues. However, a lot of them show up at my monastery. Not Elon, but a lot of techies show up at my monastery, and because technological things they don't give you any more than what I've found at university. They give you a world of linear, abstract, discursive activities, logical activities, which cannot touch the existential issue of the human life. And although it's not harmful as a servant, as a handmaiden, it does not and cannot run the house. You will be very, very unhappy humans if that's all you can do. Yeah.
To return to the subject of space and time, we have this space until 7:30, and I think we're out of time, but maybe we can use our last few seconds in joining me in thanking our speaker one last time. Thank you so much.